I started thinking about this notion of the United States of consciousness when I was with my granddaughter one night, and she wears braids often, and her braid came apart, and I started to braid her hair. And like a lot of men, I don't have good experience doing that. But it's a simple process, I think, as women know, and a braid involves 3 separate strands that you weave together. One goes over the other, and then the third one goes over that, and then the first one goes over that. And as I was doing this, I was thinking about something I think about a lot, and that's the question of how does waking and dreaming and sleeping, how are they integrated? How do they come together? And I started thinking about a braid theory, and it dawned on me that something I think that's been written about for eons, and that's that there's only one consciousness. There's only one consciousness. Do you know the word consciousness has no plural? It has no plural. So what is consciousness? I think to begin even to talk about that, well, actually, let me start with the story. How many of you have ever had an opportunity to engage in a heartfelt discussion with a fish? A couple of hands. Doesn't matter. So, you probably know if you've talked to fish that this is astounding. It was to me that fish do not believe in water. They don't believe in water. If you go up to a fish and say, you're not going to believe this, but there's this stuff that's all around you. You swim in it, you breathe in it, you eat in it, you sleep in it. It's everywhere. You live your whole life in it. The fish is going to go, get out of here. A fish doesn't experience water. Not until one fish happens to swim away from the school, break away from the culture, and swim toward the surface, and maybe even accidentally leap up, jump up out of the water, and go, oh my God, it's unwater. Only then can a fish begin even to consider the possibility that water exists. And not until we take some kind of step or leap or jump out of ordinary consciousness can we even begin to consider at some palpable level that the unconscious exists. We can't understand consciousness until we get that there is unconsciousness. I think most everybody believes that there is an unconscious that exists in everybody else, right? You can see other people acting unconsciously, but it's really difficult to witness our own unconscious. And we need to begin with, I think, this humbling willingness to consider that there's so much of ourselves that we just don't know, to open the door to knowing that. So what is consciousness? There's widespread agreement that there are 3 kinds of consciousness. There is waking, sleeping, and dreaming. And of course, there are all of these transitional hybrid states, the states in between, these borderline states that we tend not to pay a lot of attention to, that become very interesting when we look at trying to understand consciousness as a unity. What is it like to have a sort of a whole flowing consciousness? So consciousness tends to be looked at in 2 ways. One is there are states of consciousness, right? Just like there might be states in a country. This is a place model. So you can look at sleeping and dreaming and waking as states of consciousness. Back in the 60s, some of you might remember, we used to have these phrases. We would say things like, hey man, where are you coming from? Or better yet, hey man, where are you at? And it was an interesting question. It was a question that implied that there were many places inside of us, there were many states inside of us that we could come from. It also implied a very important sense of choice, of volition. I could choose where I'm coming from. So there are states of consciousness, and again, these are sleeping, dreaming, waking. Like states in a country, they each border on one another. And there are boundaries, often boundaries that are similar to the ones between nations, and sometimes similar to the boundaries we find between nations that are not necessarily friendly or completely friendly with one another. They're semi-permeable boundaries, and we'll talk about that. So we can look at consciousness in terms of states. There are places we can be. We can also look at consciousness in terms of a process. Consciousness is an awareness. It's a flashlight, if you will. It's a light that we shine. It's a way of seeing. It's a way of navigating through various states. It takes us from place to place to place. I've talked about sleeping as a state of consciousness, and I've talked about dreaming, and I want to say a few things about waking. And I think waking is maybe the most difficult state of consciousness to understand, because this is the water that we swim in as fish. We see through waking, and often we don't really get that waking is something independent of consciousness. We tend to equate it with consciousness. This is a mistake. We live in a world that places a tremendous premium on waking. I think I suggested this in one of my talks, that waking is where it's at. Waking is what it's about, right? This is the real thing. Other kinds of consciousness, sleeping, dreaming, altered states of consciousness, they're not really the center of consciousness. Waking is the center of consciousness. Waking is largely characterized by intention. Yes, intention. Intention, what I want. Now, intention might exist at a very complex hierarchy. We'll have little things that we want, little fleeting wants, deeper wants, fundamental wants, essential wants. There's layers and layers and layers of things that we want. But what we want, what we intend, intention determines perception. It's very important to understand that what I want will determine what I see in the world. Intention determines perception. Perception determines the world that I live in. If I am really hungry and I'm cruising down the street, there's a really good chance that I'm going to see restaurants and bakeries and grocery stores. Intention determines perception. It determines what I look for. It determines the frame that I place around my vision and my sensory channels. Intention determines perception. Waking life is largely driven by intention. I wouldn't say entirely, but largely driven by intention. So it's interesting to examine the layers of intention in our hearts, layers and layers of intention. And they can vary from moment to moment. They can come and they can go. One of the intentions I want to talk about is the intention that makes waking central. And this is not necessarily a personal intention, it's a cultural intention. We are socialized to believe that waking consciousness is, again to use a 60s phrase, where it's at. We tend to see waking as being primary. It dominates sleeping. It dominates dreaming. I talked about how when we tend to look at sleeping, we look at sleeping as a servant of waking life. We look at sleeping in terms of what we can expect it to contribute to the quality of our waking lives. We do the same with dreaming. We look at dreaming and understand it in terms of its contribution to waking. So there's kind of a funny boundary where waking, the state of waking, has a permeable boundary that allows it to intrude into the adjacent states of sleeping and dreaming, but there's a limitation in the other direction. There's not as much of the states of sleeping and dreaming that are allowed into waking. When we introduce waking, consciously or unconsciously, into a sleep state, we see, of course, insomnia. When we introduce it in an unhealthy way, we see insomnia. When we introduce waking into the dream world, we impose control over this other world, and we see a suppression of our dreams. Waking life in the Western world and intention in the Western world is largely governed by the psychological function we call thinking. Think about it, right? We place a tremendous emphasis on thinking, and thinking drives a lot of waking world intention. You know, many of us are just caught up. We direct our lives with thinking. What we know about thinking psychologically is that it's primarily a problem-solving function. Thinking is a tool that's designed to solve problems. Thinking allows us to create representational models. We create ideas, we create images of things, of events, of sequences, of processes. And we can play them out in our mind, or we can play them out on paper. It allows us to predict, make predictions, attempt to control run stories about what might happen. So thinking is largely about problem solving. For most of us, the thinking process is turned on constantly. It never turns off. It's turned on when we go into sleep. Most of us think our way into sleep. Most of us think our way into waking in the morning. It's on all the time. It's the primary guide we use. Now, we're all aware that there are other mental functions like sensation or intuition or emotion or feeling that can also be important. But we tend to place a premium on thinking, and premium is the medium through which intention operates. The bottom line here is that so many people unintentionally, unconsciously, lead lives that are primarily, deeply devoted to solving problems. This is a very important theme in the Western world today. Many of us live with this notion that when we get these problems solved, we'll be happy, right? When you get through this or get through that, when you solve all those financial problems, those health concerns, the relationship issues, the leak in the roof, the leak in your tire, the need for a new car, the need to return the new car because it's a lemon. It goes on and on and on and on, right? Most of us consciously or unconsciously operate with a to-do list. This is a list of problems that have to be solved. And the commercial culture, I should say, supports us in this. There's a constant development, a sequence of developing new technologies. Okay, these may be gadgets that will help us solve our problems or make us move faster, or they may be psychological instruments or tools, little tips or tricks we can use to solve our problems. Something I read that Carl Jung wrote, something I read some years ago in my 30s, really bothered me, particularly that Carl Jung wrote it. He wrote that most of life's greatest and major problems, can never be overcome. He went on to say, they can't be solved, they cannot be solved, but they can be outgrown. And this outgrowth requires the emergence of a higher consciousness. It requires a devotion to something bigger than problem solving. And I think it's something we need to wake up to. We need to step out of this sort of trance that so many of us are in about solving problems. So a great researcher in creativity once said, not much can come of a life devoted to problem solving. So the question of the continuity of consciousness, I think, requires us to take I think, what is a courageous step outside of the mainstream of life, and dedicate our lives to something bigger than what we're encouraged to, than what we're swept up into. When we begin looking at sleeping and dreaming and waking outside of intention, we begin to get a whole different experience. If waking is defined primarily by intention, dreaming and sleeping are defined primarily by reception. If waking is yang in Chinese Taoist terms, then of course sleeping and dreaming is yin. And this is the great balance, the great balancing force that we've lost in the Western world today. Whether we call it the patriarchy or hyperarousal or acceleration syndrome or whatever we call it, there's an imbalance between activity and doing and receptivity and just allowing ourselves to be. When we do that, then there is a natural permeability among the states of consciousness. We begin to see aspects of sleep appear in waking. We begin to feel the kind of sense of serenity and deep rest that we get out of sleep showing up in between waking. My spiritual mentor was fond of saying that life is lived in the pauses, not in the events. Life is lived in the pauses. And it's that background silence, that quietness. And that's the presence of sleep in everyday life. I was saying it's present for all of us all the time, and it's present right now. It's present as a kind of inner peace in the background. But of course we need to dial down the noise of waking life to hear it. Likewise, if we don't push so hard around intention, we find that aspects of the dream world are present right here and right now. You might imagine, as we sit here tonight, that this, in fact, is a dream. You might imagine that this is a dream. And that little bit of imagination for many of us can create a subtle but real palpable shift in consciousness that allows us to take off the blinders that tend to focus us in on intention and productivity and problem solving. What that does is not in any way practical. What it does is it re-enchants life. It creates a sense of vibrance, as a quivering aliveness that we begin to see within and around all things. So it opens the boundaries, and we begin to experience aspects of sleep and aspects of dreaming in waking. And likewise, ultimately, if we quiet down our waking, we can experience a kind of co-consciousness, a kind of pure awareness that shows up as lucidity in our dreams and awareness in our waking.